To take a moment and think of the Ravens. What are you picturing? The professional football team from Baltimore's logo? Nature documentary? Think of the Ravens. Do you see a flock of them circling in the air above, calling out to one another with that loud and raspy caw? Think of the ravens. Do you consider how a raven is like a writing desk? Or perhaps you think of Poe's poem, imagining a raven perched above a bedroom door, crying nevermore. Typically, when we think of the ravens, we see them as dark and sinister birds. They are synonymous with mystery and night. We see them as messengers of death, aids to the dark forces of witchcraft. This is how they're often depicted in much ancient myth. I remember the old classic cartoon show on Disney, DuckTales, and there was a bad duck. I forget the bad duck's name, but she had like raven black hair, and she had a pet raven that was always getting into mischief. They were the bad people on the show, so ravens must be bad. When we think of ravens, we may shudder or cringe or feel that prickly sensation crawl up the back of our necks as we imagine that coal black bird slowly cock its head toward us and stare at us with those large black bottomless eyes. Perhaps when it comes right down to it, we'd rather not think of the ravens at all. They remind us of dark things we'd rather forget. They creep us out or present a nuisance, kind of like all those turkey buzzards that have invaded the zoo. I think there's more turkey buzzards there than all the other animals combined at this point. We think of ravens as dirty, they're noisy, or like Poe's poem, they're enigmatic, so we'd rather just not think of the ravens at all. But we may have trouble avoiding them today, for they play a prominent role in the story of Elijah on the lam running from Ahab, the king of Israel. The weak-kneed Ahab is beguiled by the charms of a foreign woman, an ambitious and ruthless Jezebel by the name of Jezebel. That saucy queen who worshipped the Canaanite god Baal and who built an altar and temple for him in Samaria, provoking the anger of Yahweh, the God of Israel. Now, Baal was the storm god, a god of rain, a necessary element of fertility. Now, Canaanite religion held that in times of severe drought, Baal was defeated by death. But when the rains finally return to the land, it is Baal who sends them, for Baal defeats death to rise up and live again. You can see why Yahweh, the God of life itself, has little patience for Baal worship. It is not Baal who rides on the storm, but the Lord. It is not Baal who sends the rain, but the Lord. And so the Lord throws down the gauntlet right in Baal's backyard. And to do so, he sends Elijah to deliver a message. Elijah says, "As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, before whom I stand, there shall be neither dew nor rain these years, except by my word." Now, Baal was the storm god, the bringer of rain. And Elijah marches right up to the king and says, "You built that temple to Baal, huh? You think that's going to let it rain?" No. God brings the rain, and God's not going to bring any rain for a long time, not days, not weeks, not years. When the rain does come, it'll be God who sends the rain, not Baal. Do you see the significance here? When there's drought, Baal is dead, and the Lord has sent a drought, effectively killing the false god Baal. So what does Elijah get for delivering God's message? He gets to go into witness protection. He's on the run. God tells Elijah to head to a wadi, a kind of brook that fills with water only in the rainy season, so that eventually it dries up. And God says, "You shall drink from the wadi, and I have commanded the ravens there to feed you." What? I have commanded the ravens to feed you? That's weird. See, that's not the picture I want in my head when I said we should think of the ravens. I know how birds feed their young. I've seen way too many nature shows. This is just weird. Why would God feed God's prophet through a creepy, disgusting carrion bird like a raven? Can't God send like little parachutes of food down like they do in the Hunger Games or something? I mean, ravens were the buzzards of the Middle East, the carrion scavengers of Elijah's world. Ravens don't get the best press, from ancient mythology to modern-day cartoons and fairy tales. Even in the Bible, ravens aren't really presented in the best light. In Genesis, Noah sends a raven to search for dry land, but out of greed, the raven neglects to return, leaving Noah in the lurch. That's why we think of the dove bringing back the branch. The raven failed in its duties. Psalm 147 and Job 38 suggest that ravens leave their young crying for food, and they shirk the duties of parenting. In Leviticus 11:15, ravens head the list of detestable birds, and God's people are forbidden to eat them. In Proverbs 30:17, the raven is depicted as a sadistic creature gouging out the eyes of its victims. Bible. They are an abomination, the scripture tells us. And yet, God uses them to feed God's own prophet. That's weird. The Old Testament seems to have nothing but disdain for the likes of the raven. But in Luke 12:24, the ravens get a remarkably favorable presentation. In the Sermon on the Plain in Luke's Gospel, Jesus says, "Consider the ravens, think of the ravens. They neither sow nor reap, they have neither storehouse nor barn, and yet God feeds them." In the mind of Jesus, they are examples of faithfulness and beneficiaries of God's grace. The ravens, while depicted often as sadistic, evil, dark, greedy, and messengers of death, are good enough, are valuable enough to be fed by God, and valuable enough and good enough to be used by God to feed. So maybe we need to rethink the ravens. Maybe what's weird is how we've thought of them for so long. Maybe calling anything in God's good creation an abomination, unclean, or unfit for God's surface is what's really weird and wrong. Have you ever thought of yourself as a raven? Have you ever felt misunderstood? Have you ever felt judged because of how you look, where you live, who you love, how you define yourself, what your job is? Has anyone ever called you a raven? People may use other terms today, but they still mean the same thing. You are unwelcome, seen as unclean, different, unworthy, made wrong, not worth the time, a nuisance. I had a friend back in high school named Al. He dyed his hair jet black, wore the studded dog-type collars around his neck, T-shirts of heavy metal bands I'd never heard of under a long black trench coat. He was pale and often looked sickly because of a disease he didn't talk much about. If I didn't know better, I would have thought he was one of those vampires from Twilight, but he never really sparkled, so I wasn't sure. Now, people had all sorts of labels and names for him, some not nice names, without ever really knowing him. Goth, punk, trouble, junkie, freak, queer, weirdo, a raven. Al wasn't the kind of person I'd normally befriend. If I had just seen him in the halls, I probably would have thought those same things about him, especially back then. I hate to admit it, but I wasn't above that. I'm as flawed as anyone else. I don't think I would have wanted to give Al the time of day, let alone befriend him or have my soul fed by him. But he was in my acting class in high school, and I got to know him. Several of us from the class started hanging out, and I would have never thought it, but he became one of my best friends that year. And in his own way, he fed my spirit, fed my understanding of the world and difference, and he taught me some amazing things about God. I was fed by a raven. Sometimes I look in the mirror and I see a raven. Am I really a minister of a church? Doesn't God know me inside and out? Doesn't God know the kind of person I am? If I went back to my high school friends, they'd be like, "You're a what now? I can't do this. I'm not fit for this." Do you ever think like that? Like you're unworthy? Like you're afraid of being found out. You're an imposter. You can't really do what you feel called to do. We're not the only servants of God to think this way. Isaiah said he was a person of unclean lips among an unclean people. He wasn't fit to declare the message, but God spoke through him anyway. Gideon thought he was worthless since he was the youngest from the least cool tribe of Israel. Jeremiah thought he was way too young. Even Moses believed he could not speak for God because he was a murderer and a stutterer. And what of Paul, the thorn in the flesh, the history of stoning Christians, and God used him. We often say, we can't do it. Don't you know about us? We're unclean. We're like unclean ravens. God, you need someone better than me. Do you ever feel like that? Sadly, so many people are convinced they are an abomination, a mistake, an outcast, an unclean raven, maybe because they've been told so, maybe because the church has told them so. There are people who believe they shouldn't even walk through these doors because of who they are or what they've done. I received a phone call just 2 weeks ago from someone who felt like that. They said, I feel like God has cast me out. There's nothing I can do for God to ever love me again. I'm destined to hell. God has said I'm an abomination. He really believed that. And you can try to tell him, listen, look, nothing in all of creation can separate you from God's love. Go read Luke 15. But sometimes you hear the message so much. You're not good enough. You messed up too much. Even God wouldn't love you. And you begin to believe it. There are also people who've been told they're not welcome in church. They're not welcome in ministry or in God's family for a myriad of weird reasons. So they say we're unclean. We're like unclean ravens. We should be shunned, but maybe we and they should really think about the ravens. Fed by God. Cared for by God, used by God. When I think of the ravens, I think how God can use me and my faults for God's work. When I think of the ravens, I think it isn't me, it's God who is doing the feeding. And that's the key. If you hear nothing else, it doesn't matter who you are, what you've done, whatever. If God chooses to use you, you can be a blessing to an individual or the world. And God always chooses you. God can and does use exactly what you think is your weakness or what the world perceives as wrong with you or what makes you unclean or different. God has a history of doing just that. Think of the ravens, of Moses, Gideon, Isaiah, Zacchaeus, and so many others. We'll hear about Ehud in a few weeks. Think of the ravens. God will feed you, and God can use you to feed. Maybe you need to be open to the idea of being fed by a raven. Maybe those who you always thought weren't worth anything, were bad, were sick, were unclean, were beneath you, were too different from you. Maybe just the thing you need in your life. Elijah would have starved had it not been for the ravens. Sometimes we need to be fed by something or someone that the rest of the world, or maybe just us, misjudges, looks down on, thinks is wrong, or even just abhors. And when you get home, take a moment and look up ravens. You actually might learn some really interesting things. That they're actually one of the smartest animals, a brilliant bird, even used by some law enforcement agencies to do work these days. Sometimes we don't have the full picture of our animal friends. Sometimes we don't have the full picture of our human friends and neighbors. You know, Paul writes, Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. For it is written, curses everyone who is hung upon a tree. Cursed, an abomination, looked down upon. So many feel that way. But who would ever have thought that the one who will feed us at this table before us, feeds us with the bread of life, is the one the Bible says was cursed. The one who hung on an ugly, despised, old, rugged cross is the one, if we let him, will feed us for all eternity. Will feed everyone for all eternity. If you will let him. Who would have thought? Maybe Elijah. Maybe us. If we think of the ravens after all.